Good morning to everybody. صباح الخير لكل أصدقائنا في تونس وفي العالم العربي and everyone here in Washington. Please be aware that this is, as we often like to do at the Atlantic Council, a global conversation. We are webcasting live, and we are using Twitter in order to involve an audience really anywhere in the world, but particularly, we hope, in the Arab world and in Tunis to participate in this conversation that we'll be having today. We are prepared to help with Arabic translation in Twitter as well, and we will have live translation from Arabic to English and vice versa here in the audience. If you'll use your headphones, for those who don't know both languages, we have English on channel 1 and Arabic on channel 2. And as I mentioned, since we will be using Twitter, do not turn off your mobile phones, but do please put the ringers on silent. The hashtag we will use is AC, as in Atlantic Council, Tunisia, or is it Tunis? I'm sorry, AC Tunisia, I believe. With that, it is a very special pleasure and what a privilege to be welcoming here to the Atlantic Council today Mr. Hussein Abassi, who's the head of the General Trade Union of Tunisia, one of the 4 members of the Nobel Prize-winning quartet that played a critical role in Tunisia's ongoing transition to democracy, that has done so much to strengthen Tunisian civil society and to put that country on the course toward a future that the Tunisians themselves will decide for themselves. Nothing about it has been easy or will be easy, but when people like those in the quartet take that burden on themselves and exercise it so responsibly and with a spirit of service to their country, they have to succeed. And we at the Atlantic Council are very, very proud to have you with us today. Mr. Abassi, thank you so much. Also with us and helping to make this possible very much is Ambassador Faisal Goya. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for coming. Also with your deputy here, Muez Mahmoudi, a good friend of ours here at the Atlantic Council. Thank you for both of your delegations and the other diplomats in the room. I also especially would like to thank the Global Fairness Initiative under President Danilo Turk, who will be speaking with us shortly. Karen Tramontana is here with her staff, and Halima Gelman and Caleb Shreve, also of the Global Fairness Initiative, have been instrumental in helping to put this together, along with our team here at the Rafiq Hariri Center of the Atlantic Council. Karim Mezran is our senior fellow for North Africa, who follows events in Tunisia in particular with great expertise and carefully, and Catherine Wolf ably assisting and helping to pull it all together and get us here today. So thanks to everyone who's been involved. I would like to begin, and I should also say we have to be very disciplined in our conversation here today. We will have our eminent speakers present a few words. I'll interview Mr. Abassi, and then we'll take comments and questions from everybody from here in the room and from the global audience via Twitter. We're also very honored here today to have a very senior representative of the United States of America, a particular friend of mine from my own service in the U.S. Foreign Service, one of our most senior career ambassadors of the service, and that is Ambassador Christy Kenny. She's serving at the moment as Senior Advisor to Secretary Kerry, and soon we'll have her title changed to an even more elevated one when the Senate does its thing on Ambassador Tom Shannon, who's awaiting vote of the Senate, if I'm not mistaken, correct? So we'll see how that goes. With all that, why don't we begin, and why don't I ask Ambassador Kenny to introduce our next 2 speakers.
Good morning, everyone. It's a great privilege and pleasure to be here today for such a special event. I'd like to thank Ambassador Ricciardoni, my good friend, for setting up the event for us. And I think it's very fitting that today's conversation takes place at the Atlantic Council. This is an institution that has dedicated itself to opening dialogue and creating space across nations, across cultures, across groups. And I think we'd all agree that that sort of institution makes a great difference in every democracy. So we're very pleased and proud this is here. I'm going to take us back for a minute and frame a little bit about why today's conversation is so incredibly important. The United States was one of the first countries to recognize Tunisia back in 1956. Probably about half of you in the room don't remember 1956, but I guarantee everybody in the room remembers 2011, when the Jasmine Revolution came to Tunisia, a sweeping transformation. That transformation was gripping and exciting, but not necessarily easy. A few years later, that transformation encountered difficulties, complications, really by 2013 throwing the entire transition and transformation in Tunisia into doubt. Into that opening stepped citizens. Mr. Hussein Abassi and fellow citizens of the Tunisian National Dialogue Quartet stepped in, voices of civil society dedicated and committed to their country and the transition to democracy. They brokered a solution, paved the way for the drafting of a constitution that is now seen as one of the most progressive in the Arab world. This is a signal and a sign, I think, for all of us. Every nation interested in democracy takes from this example the work that citizens and civil society play in letting their voices be heard and having the courage to not just be the citizen who sits at home and wishes things were different, but to be the citizen who steps up to make a difference. Today's honoree, honored, of course, with the quartet by the Nobel Peace Prize this year, has always served. He was a teacher. I particularly appreciate that. All of us here would not be where we were without our teachers. I'm also the daughter and granddaughter of public school teachers. But a teacher who went on to teach a nation and to teach the rest of the world of what civil society means and why it matters. So I thank all of you for your attention and your interest, but most of all, Mr. Abassi, we thank you for showing us that the voice of citizens makes a huge difference and for being a great beacon. I'll conclude by saying the United States' friendship with Tunisia has grown only stronger. These past few years, the transition and the transformation in Tunisia have been a beacon and a symbol. We've partnered to help improve education, security, prosperity, and will continue to do so. We cheer Tunisia. We applaud the citizens in Tunisia who are making a difference in that country and in the rest of the world. I'm very, very pleased to be followed here today by a man who has also made a great difference in the world. Former President of Slovenia, Turk, will now next speak and say a few more words about today's distinguished guest, Dr. Hussein Abassi. President Turk.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's obviously a great privilege and honor to be invited to speak, to introduce a great leader of an important transformation, Mr. Hussein Abassi. And it's a great honor for somebody like me who has worked for the last few years in the Global Fairness Initiative, an NGO based here in Washington, but working in a number of countries around the world for improving fairness and helping the poor to get their fair position in their development of their countries. Our organization has worked in Tunisia for about 3 or 4 years now, and we have worked especially in the context of Tunisia Inclusive Labor Initiative, which is a project that involves a number of Tunisian civil society organizations, unions, and others to improve the situation of informal workers and to strengthen the legal system so that the informality becomes less of a fundamental feature of economic development in the country. This is a long-term struggle, long-term project, but one which has demonstrated the important power that the civil society in Tunisia has. And it was in this context that we have had encounters, discussions with Mr. Abassi in the past, and we have immediately recognized his great leadership, his strong commitment, the fact that he has been a lifelong leader of a very well-established union in Tunisia, something that has an extremely important role in the entire process of transformation in the country. This has been a feature which is now globally recognized by the Nobel Peace Prize. But I would like to say that Global Fairness Initiative, even before the Nobel Committee has come to a decision, has decided to recognize special importance of Mr. Abassi and awarded him with Global Fairness Award in a ceremony which took place 2 days ago here in Washington. This also allowed us to arrange for a number of meetings, and today's meeting is probably one of the most important meetings because it does give opportunity to a larger group of interested individuals, policymakers, and opinion makers to interact with Mr. Abassi, which is something that will happen in a few minutes from now. But before concluding, I would like to say a word or two also in my capacity as former president of the Republic of Slovenia, which is also one of the countries of transition, one coming from Central Europe or Eastern Europe, and one which has been, like Tunisia, seen as a successful case of transition. And we have learned in our experience that transition is a very long process, a very demanding process. We were very proud in 1991 where we established a new constitutional framework for our development. But very soon after, we had to deal with very demanding political tasks, such as creation of coalitions in an electoral system which is proportional in nature. And obviously, the experience of making coalitions and leading coalitions has been one of the more difficult political experiences. We have also realized that economic transformation takes time. Now, Slovenia has been fortunate in many respects, and our economic problems are not so deep, but still we realize that there is a need for a great deal of patience in the economic transformation, in balancing the necessary discipline or necessary system in the domain of public finance, managing the public spending in an appropriate manner, and at the same time guaranteeing good economic future to people, to all people in the country. Now, this, of course, are very demanding tasks, and some of which Mr. Abassi knows more probably than anybody else in this room. So I would like to conclude here and say we are very privileged to have a leader of this format among us, and we look forward to hear from him about the experience of Tunisia and about his expectations for the future of the country and for the support of the entire international community to the transformation in Tunisia. So, Mr. Abassi, you are kindly asked to take the floor and speak to the participants.
As you notice, I'm rather short. Good morning, everybody. First of all, in this wonderful occasion where I can gather with all of you in this center, the Atlantic Council, and particularly the Tawfiq Hariri Center, for this invitation that I received on the occasion of my visit to the United States of America, and in Washington, D.C. in particular, to receive the award that was given to me in recognition of the efforts that I exerted in the social field, and not only or not necessarily in the national political fields. And I was extremely happy to be here, and I received the award 2 days ago. I received this award in a beautiful reception, very warm reception, and I thank all the leaders and staff of Global Fairness Initiative for their recognition and for the acknowledgement of the work of the Tunisian Labor Union Federation, and I also thank the people who organized this gathering, and all the speakers that preceded me for the kind words and the introduction and the touching words that they have said. And I think that there was some exaggeration of what we've done. I think that whatever we have done, no matter how important, is really does not deserve all this much gratitude. Before talking about the experiment that we have embarked into with other parties of the civil society, let me first of all very quickly remind everybody, or let me at least give a little background about the organization whom I have the honor to lead right now in different historic moments in Tunisia. The union, the labor union, is obviously a syndical, and anybody that thinks labor union thinks that it is an organization that works to advocate for the workers and their social welfare. This is the logical, conventional role of a union. However, what is the specificity of the Tunisian Labor Federation, since it was established in January 20th, 1946, and next year we're going to be celebrating the 70th anniversary of the establishment of our great organization. So the founders took upon themselves that this organization is not going to limit itself to the social advocacy for labor, but also for any needs that the national community, that the society, that the country would need at any point. The union was present, was a leader in the struggle for independence. When the French colonial power imprisoned and sent into exile a number of political leaders, the union, the Tunisian union, replaced filled that vacuum. Therefore, it gathered both roles. Our founding leader, Farhat Hashed, who was assassinated in February 1952, at that time he was not only advocating for social problems and social issues, but he was also struggling and working and fighting for the independence of the country, and he had many serious fights against the colonial French. There were a lot of casualties and victims in Enfida, and even many decades after many years after the founding of the Union. In Sfax, for example, 31 martyrs were killed and more than 300 wounded, and at least 3,000 workers were fired from their job at that time. Of course, the population was very limited and its economy was not that big. Then Anfida events also were bloody, so that the colonial powers saw that that particular leader, Farhat Hashed, needs to be taken out of the picture, not because he was fighting for the rights of workers, but he was representing the struggle of all a nation, for all his nation. Therefore, this organization throughout its life has always linked between the social and the national issues, but not in a political sense. We obviously pay attention to the national needs, and every time we see that the country is in need of intervention, every time we see that there are major threats or a major fracturing or division within the society, we sometimes have the capacity to foresee the threats, and therefore we try to bring the people, the different parties together and force dialogue. It is not easy to do, to play this role. The powers obviously all hate to have a strong labor union or a strong civil society. All the various governments since the independence to date worked to debilitate this organization, our organization, to reduce or limit its independence and limit its scope. There has been always a struggle and tension between the UGTT and the various powers and governments of Tunisia. In our history, of course, is not all rosy. On the contrary, this insistence of our organization to be part of the national dialogue led to various crises in 1965, on January 26, 1978, and after that the crisis in 1986. So throughout our history there have been these struggles and wars to keep our independence, the independence of our organization, and to have a say in the national dialogue and the national discussion. So everybody is convinced that this union has the right to combine the two, but not at all times, only when it is needed. The Tunisian labor union, since the beginning of the revolution, noticed the threat coming, that the social explosion was about to come. In our Department of Research, we've conducted a number of research on the cities in the interior of the country, and we've did a lot of work on the unbalance, and that the growth or the supposed growth over the years had never been translated into real development and in increase in employment, in jobs. So even before the revolution, we have been conducting these researches 4 years before the revolution about Sidi Bouzid itself, where the revolution spark started, and we've been calling everybody's attention that the injustice, that the lack of justice, of fairness in the economy and the development, that this was a time bomb and that was going to explode immediately. We've noticed it's going to be troublesome in Gafsa, in Kef, all these regions regions that have been deprived from any development and who are living a great imbalance and injustice in terms of economy and in social welfare. Unfortunately, the government of Ben Ali never heeded what we were saying, and we've organized different forums and conferences to talk about this. In vain, unfortunately. That's what led the youth to take to the streets. That's what happened at the end of 2010, and we all know what happened. Of course, we have had a role. Of course, we're not going to claim that we have started the revolution. We have, in a way, set the groundwork for it. And the civil society, even limited at that time, had a role. But the organization that had presence throughout the country was our union. We helped or we galvanized those youth in the regions, in the interiors. We galvanized the protests, the rallies, and after that another phase, the second plan, which was to help these street movements. We turned them, we involved the workers in the greater region of Tunis, the January 14th, the strike that led to the Ben Ali fleeing the country. Ben Ali fled, actually, and he never left a constitution that would avoid the vacuum. He left without any provisions of the constitution on who steps in to fill that vacuum. So there were a period of great fear. The institutions were dismantled. The government fell apart. The parliament was shut down. So, of course, we stepped in at that time, not on our own, but we led the civil society at that point. The real civil society associations were very limited, really, were a handful. There were thousands of them, obviously, on the books, but most of them were just cosmetics, and they were at the payroll of the dictatorship. And so a number of organizations that were part of us with the quartet, two organizations, the Tunisian Bar Association and another two of them that stood with us in throughout the various crises that I talked about. Of course, the first invitation or the first call, we called these smaller associations of the civil society, but we did not exclude some of the political parties, those who were official during the Ben Ali, but obviously there are a number of fictitious political parties at that time. We did not invite them, but we invited those parties who were legally recognized, but also had some representation in the society. And we started in the first meeting, as I remember, there were like 9 people, some of the civil society and some of the political parties, and then we became 13, then 19, then 21, and then at that point we saw to set a committee to protect the revolution, but also to reinforce the continuity of the state and its institutions. But we also felt the need to find a way out, a legislative way out or a legal way out, and to go to the elections, the election of a Constituent Assembly to draft a new constitution, because the previous constitution was completely destroyed by the number of weird and unacceptable amendments. It was almost a constitution prefabricated to uphold the dictatorship and the tyranny, and it was not in favor of the people. So in that very short time, we had to establish an institution that was a small organization that would fill the vacuum, because we needed a legislative power. So that committee, of course, was not elected, but it was based on consensus between the civil society and some of the political parties who were there. And the political parties and the social forces, the civil society was there, or were there. And in less than a year, it played the role of preparing some draft laws needed by the country, and then we would take that to the provisional president, so that the president was, of course, governing the country through executive orders, and we were then very worried about securing the continuity of the state. When that phase was over, there was the election of the Constituent Assembly. It became the only institution elected by the people. Formed a government of the Troika that was composed of three parties at that time, and things started working. So the Constituent Assembly was a main institution. Its main role was to draft the Constitution, but at that time it was overburdened with a number of other roles. So the Constituent Assembly, drafting the Constitution, but it became acting as a parliament, as a legislative body. And during that period, that transition period, of course there are too many details that we can't cover here. Crisis started, tensions and frictions within the society, and that led to the beginning of violence, verbal violence, threats, and then terrorism accidents. And just before that, there were a few associations or gangs that really broke the law. They aggressed everybody, on artists, on comedians, on other events, and our own labor union came under such attacks when we had a strike of 4 years for the municipal workers. And as we were preparing to commemorate an important day, which was the day of the assassination of our founding leader on December 5th. So the plan was for the rally to walk from the headquarters of our union to the burial sanctuary of Farahat Hashed. And we came under attack from gangs of terrorists who wanted to occupy our headquarters. And we said at that point, when it turned into political assassination, our young political leaders, Shukri Belaid, and a couple of months later, Mohammed Brahmi. So these two acts of violence were also accompanied by a number of killings of our member of our armed forces, of our police. You have remind me of the time, because I tend to talk too much. At that point, at that decisive moment of our country, and before getting to the political assassinations, we've warned that the threat is real, that terrorism is really looming on us, and that it is starting to take shape. So, all Tunisians, please come, let's sit around the table, let's start a national dialogue that would prevent these oncoming threats of terrorism and violence. Many responded positively. Unfortunately, some political parties did not want to be part of this national dialogue, but despite that, in 2012, at the initiative of our labor union, we added the Human Rights Organization and the Bar Association, but that led to a second assassination, and there was many attempts to bring down, to obstruct this initiative. They all failed. After the second assassination, we launched a second initiative, and we told the Tunisian, you see what happens if you don't heed the call for the first initiative for national dialogue? The second initiative, of course, there were obstructionists. The national dialogue in its public and on the record meetings 167 hours, but the behind the curtain work and informal and negotiations and bilateral negotiations was thousands and thousands of hours to prepare those public events were all ironed out. The second initiative, of course, we added the fourth member, which was the association of employers or of business owners. It was important for us to rely on or to be ready for a plan B in case it fails. And what if those many parties who were not serious about the dialogue? It was important for us we've put all the burden on our leadership at the union organization and all those who believe in arriving to a modern democratic Tunisia. So the plan B was out of reach for anybody except for the union. So through protests and very loud rallies who pointed the finger to those parties who were not serious, who were being hypocritical with the national dialogue, who did not want it to succeed, and that had an important impact on all those who were reluctant. And this occasion, I would like to say that the objective or the goal was not to achieve what we have achieved. But we don't want to be claiming heroism here. It's what I want to say, that we were able to raise the awareness among the public in general, the civil society and the political parties, because at a certain point they were able to overcome partisanship, and many paid a huge price in the elections that came right after. So many parties paid with their own existence. Others came up. So if they were not responsive to us, the dialogue would have never succeeded, and we would have never been able to talk about this exceptional success of Tunisia. I'd like to recognize the efforts of all those who are not in the picture right now, because they gave precedence to the national interest rather than the partisanship. That what led us to elections. And now we have a parliament that is representative of the people, of the different tendencies. We have an elected president, and we are now finishing the necessary institutions, the constitutional institutions, so that we really finish building this democratic, progressive, democratic state that we want to be a beacon in our region. Unfortunately, all other countries that went through revolution and whose youth and whose men and women had so many ambitions about the revolutions, unfortunately, those revolutions turned to anger in most cases, and you see what happened in Yemen, in Syria, in Libya, and other Arab countries. I'd like to say that this effort that led to the Nobel Peace Prize Award contains a number of messages. First of all, to the labor unions and trade unions, that they have an important role. They advocate for workers and employees, but they also have to be part in the national dialogue and to be a balancing element in societies. I think one of the members of the quartet that has been awarded, because this award is not to the union but to the unions of the world, of the labor unions of the world, that it is now perceived as a force that can help its nations and bringing about peace and consensus. The second message to all civil society forces, if they are really representative and if they really believe in the national interest, they can play a role in tipping the balances or to in favor of the interest of the society. It is also a message to the civil society not to compartmentalize the vision through very specific committees and perspectives, each one duplicating the work of others. It is important to gather the efforts and to join in coalitions. The other point is that we have played a part, and that we played a part in bringing about peace. We are in a region that is undergoing a lot of imbalance, a lot of instability and a lot of tension. We tell them that weapons are not the solution. Look at all the revolutions. Even if they were armed at some point, I think that even at the end of the weapons and violence, dialogue is going to be necessary at some point. So why not start with dialogue if it's inevitable? So after just look at what happened in Somalia, for example, in terms of failing of a state, and that can happen anywhere, and particularly in the Arab countries that are under this kind of threat. I'd like also to send a message to the world, to the superpowers, to help the civil society to leave space and to listen to these civil society members and to the labor unions, because the labor unions have proven that they can play major national roles. So it is a message also to the people who fight and advocate for peace. There is a lot of tension in the Arab region and elsewhere, that these superpowers, major powers, need to think deeply and work very seriously to combat terrorism, because terrorism has now become a challenge that no single country can address on its own, because terrorism has become globalized, and terrorism has no boundaries. It thrives on insecurity, it thrives on instability, it thrives on chaos. So it has to be addressed internationally. Terrorism was attacked New York, Paris, Spain, Tunisia, and still has a long list of targets. So fighting terrorism, it cannot be localized as it has to be done at the international level. I'd like also to say that in the Arab region that also needs a number of dialogues, just like the one we've conducted in Tunisia to solve its problems, but you have to be confident that there will be no stability in the Arab region before addressing the Palestinian question. The people are asking to implement the international legitimacy. This question is being forgotten, and I am surprised that in the General Assembly of the United Nations in its last session, the major powers, in their speeches, there was a total absence of any mention to the Palestinian or to any solution. Unfortunately, the major countries, nobody ever mentioned the Palestinian question, not even in one sentence. So be sure that there will be no stability in the Arab world without finding a solution to that question. Our message is to the world is that humanity can live in peace. Stability can be brought about. There is no security without social stability. Social stability is the basis for security. So if there are advocates for this, we see parties and governments some support, but we also, the civil society, need to put all the pressure to change the status quo. Lastly, I want to say that my country, Tunisia, today, after what happened, after the success of the national dialogue and after starting to build the democratic country, still needs a lot of support, a lot of help from its friends and brothers and sisters. And we don't want people to forget about us. Not to be understood what I'm saying that we are asking for charity. We are just saying that we ask people to be patient. We might reschedule some loans, knowing that Tunisia has always kept its word in terms of paying back its debt. But we're going through dire economic situation, and we need to find that equitable equation between what is needed and the necessities of the country socially and economically. If anybody really pays or has any importance to the democratic transition. So let's preserve this flowering rose in the Arab region. If it makes it, then it will send positive messages and be a model for the rest of the countries in the region. And let's be sure that if this experiment fails, I know what will happen, but just to be positive, what will happen will be unbearable to the Arab region or any part of the world. As you say, as you can see today, if the world does not stand together to fight terrorism, if today major powers and superpowers, they're not going to find that link between economic stability and security, there will be no social social peace. I met with President Trumka of the AFL-CIO, and he said that the injustice going through in the United States, that the rate of suicide among workers, American workers and employees and salaried people is higher than ever. So we have to call on the international financial institutions. We agree with them that we want stronger economy. We want, obviously, corporations that are successful, that have productivity and returns. But there is a social phenomenon that we have to salute, the World Bank. But the IMF, which was against even sitting together and sitting at the same table with labor unions, today at least we have seen a slight change in that attitude. These meetings are not as positive as we think, but these are timid steps, and we all know that the 10-mile race starts with one step, and we hope that the people believe in the labor union movement and in the possibility of playing a major role. I'm sorry if I spoke for too long, and I'm going to look forward now to questions and interaction, and I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you.
تفضل. العربي رقم 2. أولا شكرا جزيلا سيد عباسي على كلماتك.
Thank you, Mr. Abassi, for these wonderful words.
Yeah, but I will speak in English. I will speak in English, and then the Arabic should appear on channel 2. تمام. Said Abassi, indeed you answered a number of the questions that I had, and I want to make sure that there's lots of time for people in our audience here in Washington and indeed in Tunisia and across the Arab world, if people are listening. You spoke very powerfully of what is happening and what must happen in Tunisia and in the Arab world. You spoke powerfully on the role of civil society. Your messages to the outer world, to the great powers, were also very clear and powerful, I thought. I'd like to follow up, if I may, on that particular message. I was an American diplomat. We had Ambassador Kenny here, one of our foremost diplomats from the United States government. I know many Americans in government and outside wish we could find ways to be more effective in promoting civil society, democracy, human rights. At the very least, to do no harm, but more than that, to help advance progressive voices and forces throughout the societies that find themselves in conflict and without the tools to resolve their conflicts in peaceful, lawful, democratic ways. So I would ask you, if I were the new American ambassador to Tunisia, for example, I hope you will meet Mr. Rubenstein very soon upon your return, how can foreigners, how can Americans, Europeans, diplomats of other Arab countries, representatives of other great powers, how can we, in an appropriate and respectful way, give voice to visionaries in your society? How can we do that in a way that does not cross the limits of rejection, the limits of propriety that cause rejection of the support? It's a very tricky thing to get right. For example, we at the Atlantic Council are glad to welcome you here, give you a platform to speak with America and back with your own country. What more specifically do you want Americans to do to support civil society in your country? And as you're thinking of that, I will remind everyone, if you'd like to pass in questions by Twitter, we're using the hashtag #ACTunisia.
Thank you, Ambassador. There's actually a number of questions, or two questions at least, not one. The first one is about the new ambassador in Tunisia. And by the way, ambassadors are representatives between states, but they are also, we at the labor union, we've always been open to meet with anybody who seeks to meet with us and talk about any issue that wanted to be talked about. We don't have any rejection or reluctance to talk to anybody. We listen, we discuss. If it is about something that can be of interest to our people, to our society, to our nation, we'll definitely applaud and support. In some cases, we might have different points of view regarding some particulars or details. Everybody has the right and the opportunity to explain why you accept this and reject something else. We are not closed to anything. We have been always open to foreign representatives of their countries, the ambassadors or otherwise. At least on a weekly basis, we receive 2, 3, maybe 4 ambassadors, and these dialogues and these meetings take place in our headquarters every time, but obviously with respect of our specificity. We do not interfere in their business, and anytime we perceive that there is some meddling in our affairs, we let the other party know. Obviously, many people wanted to support the national dialogue. It was being held under economic and social circumstances that were very difficult in the country, and we used to tell people that any economic help was welcome so that the country can sustain itself and the development can continue. But we told them that the dialogue was internal, and we had the capacity, we had the expertise, the knowledge, the experience. These are a national domestic matter that we'll be able to deal with it on our own. But we cannot do without support in terms of what our country needs. The previous ambassador came to the UGTT a number of times. Our doors have always been open and will remain open, and we discussed with him, and we're open to anybody's point of view. Of course, today here, of course, has some government representatives, and that's why I said what I said, but rest assured that I say the same thing everywhere I go. Never change, I never cater my discourse. What I said in front of you, I also said to leaders, to governments, to the U.S. government representatives, and we count on your support, on the U.S. government support in terms of security, in terms of economy. Of course, it's a major country, it's a superpower. Other major countries also need to intervene in fighting terrorism. I told them to be patient, don't treat Tunisia as a stable economically and security country, because they're asking us to start to embark immediately in major reforms, that are needed now are the reforms in the economical sector, but that need to take into consideration the social situation and the social needs. That reforms and the models need to be born from within the country, and it is not possible to put all this pressure so that in this such short period of time we accomplish these reforms. But please talk to us as a country in transition that is still looking for reviving its economy, so please be patient, and that the failures or maybe what we cannot reach in 2015, we will reach at the end of 2016 or maybe 2017. What we've also said, that we have been now establishing a plan to reach social stability in the country. So not only that, but to be able to focus our attention to discussing the major pillars of the economy, the development model that created growth without creating development, that created resources to the country but did not go to equitable distribution. We need fiscal reform, and we've started some of these reforms, and some of the positive impacts started to be seen, but we think that 2016 will be done with the fiscal reform, because it is practically the first pillar for correcting the shortcomings of the national resources, and we need the labor laws to be reformed, the investment laws to be reformed, and so a number of issues that we are already talking about. We have another particular challenge that by the end of 2016, if this social stability is guaranteed, that we count on a revival, an economic revival that would increase the growth rate. Maybe our hope is 1.5 to 2%, despite the very negative impact of the two terrorist attacks that took place in Bardo, the museum, and in one of the tourist resorts in Tunisia, that really gave a strong blow, which was the spine of our economy. Tourism is the spine of our economy, so we have a lot of work to do. We have to increase our production, we have to increase the efficacy of our productivity to reach by the end of 2016 1.5 to 2% of growth rate. We have a security challenge, as we conducted a national dialogue to find a solution to the political deadlock. We're also working to bring everybody together, to stand together in the face of terrorism, but obviously national dialogue cannot resolve security threats. That's the armed forces, that's the police forces, but at least they have to be at least relying on a society that is standing with them to reach the security. We've asked the major countries, the United States officials, for tourism to start again in Tunisia is not enough to say that tourism is great in Tunisia, or let's work with tour operators. That's not the point. What matters are the political decisions. A number of major countries to issue warnings or travel warnings. Our diplomacy, Tunisia needs to start talking with these countries to lift those travel bans or travel warnings who hurt our country. We are taking all precautions to protect tourists in all our resorts and in all our the places where they can go. Many countries have reviewed their decision and retracted the warning or the ban, like Sweden. Some countries. So we've started to see the effects of lifting those bans, but a number of other countries maintain the bans and the warnings. So maybe this is one of the messages I want to transmit. In terms of the American support to the civil society, I was not very clear on the question, how can the government help the social society? The U.S. government might need maybe some programs for building capacity, but I think that the civil society in Tunisia, of course, is quite active. We need economic help. We need help to the tourism sector. More than we need more social security, civil society. Freedom of the press is doing quite well. The slogans and the ambitions of the revolution were job, freedom, and social justice. Freedom has been accomplished. Of course, we need to stay vigilant, but we are confident that the civil society today in our country has a lot of capability and is paying a very close attention to what's going on. And the civil society will protect this transition process when there are deviations or backpedaling.
I'm afraid we're awfully close to running out of time. I would very much like to permit at least one response or a question. I'm going to ask Mohammed whether you received... I'm afraid we're awfully close to running out of time, and I would very much like to permit at least one response or a question. I'm going to ask Mohammed whether you received something by Twitter, or should we just rely on the audience that is here? Let us do that then. And then we'll have to be very brief. It has to be a question, I'm afraid, and not a speech, because we'll simply run out of time. Sir, and then we'll see if that lady there. And please state your name and any association.
Thank you. Munji Dawadi from the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy. مرحبا بك سي حسين مع delegation اللي جات معك. My question is, many say that Tunisia right now needs another national dialogue on the economics. In that dialogue, I'm assuming the UGTT will be a participant. It will not be a facilitator. Who would you think would facilitate such a role? And is the UGTT, if it's part of that dialogue, willing to make the necessary concessions to make the economic dialogue a success?
And I'm afraid we have we're actually 10 minutes over, so a very short response, please.
Dialogue to stand together against terrorism. It also needs a dialogue about economy. Of course, the dialogue about economy, we cannot tell these four members of the quartet, maybe the human rights organizations. We cannot obviously be called for this this kind of dialogue, because we are a party in these tensions, in this conflict, and we, despite the obvious and objective contradictions between us and the business associations, we cannot obviously call for this initiative, and the Tunisian Business Association cannot either call for this initiative. We talked about this before, and an initiative that they had started, I told them that it was a stillborn, because someone who is a party in a conflict cannot be neutral enough in terms of their own interests. So, of course, we don't reject the idea of dialogue, but just to let you know, we don't need such a dialogue because we've signed a social pact, and 5 committees worked on this social pact. One of them is especially focusing on social dialogue. We've presented a draft law that was given to the cabinet council, that was adopted, and it's now being reviewed by the parliament. So for the first time, we're going to institutionalize this social dialogue in our country. So it includes the business owners and the representative of the labor movement and the representative of the government. And this law will also include any stakeholders in the economy or in the social sectors. We don't need anybody to start an initiative like this. We can only think that the human rights organization is the only one that is not a real stakeholder in the economy or in the social sector, can be partial enough to organize. But we really don't need it at this point. This draft law is in the parliament right now. It will be adopted hopefully before the end of this year, and there will be this institution where the social parties or the social stakeholders will be able to sit down and resolve all the issues within this framework, this institutional framework, in the direction in terms of bringing about the economic revival that we all need.
As they say in Egypt. I'm afraid that we've run out of time. We've gone over time. Your words have been so interesting. Perhaps if there are other comments or questions, you might be willing to stay. As they say in Egypt. I'm afraid that we've run out of time. We've gone over time. Your words have been so interesting. Perhaps if there are other comments or questions, you might be willing to stay and speak with some people individually. I don't want anyone to feel disappointed, to the extent you can save us more time. But we must close this program. We're busy here at the Atlantic Council, and there'll be other programs to follow here today. We are so honored, sir, that you joined us. Thank you very much. You've enlightened us all, and we wish you great success in the rest of your program in Washington.
شكرا.
شكرا جزيلا. Thank you very much.